and I will go ahead and share the presentation and we'll get started. Great. So hopefully you can all see the screen. And so hopefully, as you know, the title of the book is Cultural Mega-Events, Opportunities and Risks for Heritage Cities. This is a work that, as I mentioned, was published last year, but derived over a much longer process from my PhD thesis that I did at the Politecnico di Milano. And still, I've been working on similar issues recently, as I mentioned in the HOMI project, and also part of the TAO lab at Politecnico, the Transnational Architecture and Urbanism lab. So for the lecture today, I want to first talk a bit about the development of the book, which I think is always interesting to get a bit more of the insight to how something like this comes about, what goes into this, especially how it's evolved or changed from a PhD thesis. Then I'll very shortly look at the main arguments that I make in the book, which is first what I identify as two ongoing mega event trends that we can observe, and then what that means for heritage cities. Then I'll spend most of the presentation looking at those issues more specifically in the three case studies. So that of Genoa 2004, Liverpool 2008, and Istanbul 2010, which were all the European Capital of Culture program. And then we'll conclude with an overview of some of the emerging and future issues facing mega events, identified one through the research, but also in light of the ongoing unfortunate COVID situation and how that's perhaps also contributing to changing the future of events. So, as I've said, this is I'm happy to be here and be able to present this. In other more smaller private presentations, I focus more on some of just the main arguments, the sections 2 and 3 of this. So today will be a bit more of a broader overview, which hopefully will give you a good sense of the work and this process that's now been going on for essentially 6 years from beginning to final publication. So this started as my PhD thesis, I think as many academic books do. So similarly titled, but slightly different, was the Synergies and Frictions Between Mega Events and Urban Heritage in the European Capital of Culture program, comparative study of the three cities of Genoa, Liverpool, and Istanbul. And so developing the thesis, I spent also a period of time as a PhD fellow at the Istanbul Studies Center in Turkey, as well as then a PhD visiting researcher at the Institute of Cultural Capital based in the University of Liverpool in the UK. And so that allowed me to do a lot of on-site research and to be able to write this book, began with the typical literature review, analyzing various documents, press reviews, interviewing the key actors and stakeholders, decision makers, as well as sort of outside experts in all three of these cities. And then, of course, on-site analysis of what projects were completed, or as we'll see in some cases, not completed. And through that, develop this individualizing case study analysis. So rather than sort of directly comparing Genoa to Liverpool or to Istanbul, taking them all, kind of learning from each of them, and then building a larger argument or a greater understanding from these three parts. So the work began with selecting these cities. Essentially, I did an analysis to see what were the possible cities that might be interesting or worthwhile to study. And I began by looking at what were the World Heritage cities that had hosted this, specifically the European Capital of Culture. I decided this was an interesting event to focus on as it deals it's spread across Europe. It's been widely hosted by a number of cities and deals a lot with issues of heritage, but yet hadn't previously been studied in depth, the specific ways that these issues overlap or connect the planning of these large events. And rather than studying the Olympics, where they're very different between different cities, I decided to start here. And as the years have gone on, our research is starting to expand perhaps more in that direction. But back in 2014, I decided to focus on just cities in Europe with World Heritage status and which had hosted the event. And that led me to Genoa, Liverpool, and Istanbul, I wanted three cities that were quite different, quite diverse in how the themes of the event, how they use the event, and also within the nature of the cities themselves, the countries that they were located in. Part of that being the differences in the planning systems as well as heritage protection. And we see between Italy, UK, and Turkey, Italy tends to be much more regional in their different approaches to planning, so there can be a lot of variety. Traditionally, a reliance on master plans, but then more recently, we're seeing more planning tools like strategic planning. Meanwhile, the UK has a much stronger focus on local authorities, as well as now even the local neighborhood planning has become, since the study, a very important aspect. So there's a very different shift in focus in who's making the decisions. And then finally, Turkey tends to be a much more heavily centralized system, even following the decentralization laws of 2004, 2005. It remains a lot of heavy central control. And so the way that decisions made there were very different from the other two cases. So the idea was to see how does one mega event adapt to all of these very different settings, as well as how do these settings um, take on a mega event? How do they change in response? And so that added a bit of richness to the study. So that was more or less how I started working with a PhD, and then from having finished that, working essentially 2 years to get the book published, was a significant shift from where a PhD really has to have a strong hypothesis that you then explore through the research to be able to answer your main research questions. The book is an entirely different structure, and so I had to work a lot more to take what I had learned from the PhD and really start by framing that within a much kind of global phenomenons, global trends. So saying, here are my findings, here is my argument, here's my position, and then going through the cases to demonstrate the relevance of this to these cities, as well as, I argue, potentially many other cities. And so it took a lot of work it was not a simple matter of, okay, copy and paste the PhD and publish it as a book, by no means. It was not just a matter of rewriting or editing the existing chapters, it was also writing a number of completely new chapters. And I found particularly the issue of defining cultural mega events became quite important, and saw that throughout the research, a questioning of, well, are these large cultural events mega events or not? And so in the beginning of the book, I deal a lot with how do we define mega events, and questioning some of the usual traditional definitions that we find, or that rely purely on quantitative measures, and proposing that actually, if we take a more spatial look, or we look at the cultural and economic impact of these events within their context, relatively speaking, cultural mega events can be just as, if not more important than other events. For example, as the case of Liverpool that I'll be discussing later, I found that if you look at the overall cost of the 2008 Capital Culture, and consider the per capita cost for a city of 400,000 residents, compare that to the London 2012 Olympics, where billions were spent, but of course is a much larger city, I found that actually Liverpool per capita was more expensive. So it really depends on your way of thinking and framing these events in these cities. So while these tend to be much smaller, medium-sized cities hosting these events rather than global metropolises, the event forms a very important key moment in the development or the future framing of the city, and they often approach it in that way, that this is a moment they can't repeat. So from what I argue in the book is that we can, or there's a blurry line. It's not such a distinct division between, say, sport mega events and cultural mega events, that we can see similar phenomenon and perhaps even learn from these different events, one to the other. And we'll discuss that a bit more on the next slide. As we see this ongoing trends that I found, or in myself and other researchers have begun to discuss and talk about, is that actually cultural mega events have really begun diffusing globally. They're no longer limited to just a certain area like Europe. And so as they spread out, as well as events like the Olympics are beginning to change and alter their forms, we see there's a much greater potential for them to have an impact or to interact with historic areas of cities. And so there's a need for heritage cities to really be aware of these opportunities, but also the risks. So that's more or less the general framing for the book that I then use to develop and go through and explore the cases. So these two diagrams are trying to argue that on one hand we have cultural mega events that we are spreading all over the world. Not all of these perhaps are mega events, or they're much smaller versions, but this idea of using culture to promote cities, to brand cities, has become very attractive. And so we're seeing areas and regions all over the world adopting this. Even very recently, the City of London developed the London Borough of Culture, so an intra-city scale. So we're seeing from within one single city to entire continents promoting areas or cities through culture. Meanwhile, with the Olympics, we've seen in recent years a number of candidate cities dropping their bids, and the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, responding to that by allowing cities a bit more flexibility in how they plan and approach and host the Olympics. So both in 2024 Paris Olympics and the Milan Cortina 2026 Olympics, we see radically new approaches being proposed. So while it's still very early to know whether are these trends going to continue long term, or these just sort of one-off, and then we're going to go back to the sort of bigger is better mentality. But we see Paris proposing 95% of all venues will be existing or temporary. We see many of those taking place either within historic structures or within historic areas of the city. And so there's this very close diffusion of an event like the Olympics into the existing fabric of a historic city. And also in Milan, while it's the Winter Olympics, we see many sites being also proposed to be used in Milan and other cities as they're spreading their event out regionally, which introduces a number of other new issues that typically we don't encounter so often. So they're two, in a way, clear, different trends, but somehow finding a meeting point, potentially in historic cities, or by using the cities in different ways. We might see a much greater use or interaction with heritage. So that's where, for me, it became clear, there's something we need to better study and understand here. And that's why I'm very thankfully been able to work on this topic for now the last 6-7 years. And I use this image as an example. It's not from one of the cases. This is the city of Graz in Austria, where for this cultural mega event in 2003, the European Capital of Culture, they built this, the Kunsthaus Graz, which, as you can tell, is quite a sort of shocking insertion into what is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This is well embedded within the boundary of the city center, and there's much debate about, does something like this belong in a historic city or not? And I think there arguments can be made from both sides, but it really requires an awareness, a consciousness, a thinking about this. And in some cases, this has been very positive in bringing much greater attention to this part of the city that was often overlooked and empty and abandoned space. And part of this even involved restoring nearby buildings. So as an image, it's very powerful and helps to depict the potentialities of both the opportunities or threats we might encounter. So within these events, when cities choose to host them, there is a number of sort of initial areas we can say to explore or to consider. How were these thought about in the planning process or not? So first of all, what is the role of heritage? Is it part of the theme? Is it projects using heritage spaces or restoring buildings or not? Or has it been overlooked? What about the potential stresses as these events are designed to attract a high volume of tourism during the event and long term? Are tourism, sustainable tourism plans being developed that help to navigate the historic spaces of the city, rather than just creating a Disneyfication effect? What about funding? As these events do bring significant amounts of money, is any of that going to heritage works or heritage projects, whether conservation or otherwise? As we'll see, there are all very typical governance structures that are introduced. So who's making the decisions for these events? And are heritage actors part of that decision-making body or not? Are they left out? Will determine what happens over the long term. and what kinds of legacies the event might have. Uh, and then finally, how is heritage itself coming to change or affect the decisions made for the event? And is it considered seen as being an opportunity? Is it tied in with other long-term goals and strategies or not? So generally going into the research, these were some of the ideas that I wanted to try to look into, to investigate, and then see across the three cases what were, if these things were happening or not, why was that the case? Um, so I'll now go with this bit of a background to the main issues and interests of the book, the three cases, starting with Genoa, which was the earliest case, the capital culture in 2004, and it really represents a cultural mega event embedded within a strategic vision for heritage development. So hopefully that will make more sense by the time I get through the case. Um, in some ways, Genoa is a very interesting case because it's not an instance of a single mega event in 2004. It's actually, they had a series of mega events over a 12-year period, starting with the 1992 Expo, as well as the 2001 G8 meetings, and then ending with the 2004 European Capital of Culture. So this map here on the right shows some of the works in the gray dash that were completed for the 92 Expo, which really focused on the waterfront. And really that was an area of the city that had been physically cut off. It had been privatized. So this was an opening of the waterfront back into the city, making it a cultural and touristic space, and starting to begin this process of rebranding the city as a cultural destination, which in this case in 92 led to them constructing the aquarium, which has been a very important attractor for the city. But as we see, it was much of the works were focused almost exclusively on the waterfront and very little works elsewhere. And so their following 92 was a bit of a still somehow a disconnect, or the city center as a whole wasn't fully functioning or working. So there was a need or a sense that something more had to be done, and that led to the city seeking out the capital of culture, but doing so in a way, learning from this previous experience to try to develop a much more strategic approach by bringing together many different actors from different levels, and develop really a series of plans tied together, focused on 2004. And so here I have a list of some of those, a number of different projects with funding coming from the EU or from Italy or from the region of Liguria. And so rather than focus on individual separate projects, their strategy by having this large conference and developing a strategic plan was to tie all of these together. And so in a sense, multiplying the overall budget by doing different projects, but very coordinated together, and using parts of one budget combined with another, they could do a much greater number of works than they could previously. So we see it was not just that they hosted one large event and that was it. No, it was really embedded and connected with all of these other plans and policies that we see, which in large part was connected to the new mayor who was elected, who came in with a strong sense of a need to do something very quickly. And I define these three periods that the earlier one with the Expo was experimenting a bit, seeing how this might work, what it could do for the city, but again, very disconnected from other approaches. And then we get to this 10-year, more or less 10-year period where all of these different activities are super coordinated. Many different actors are involved. Also, the private sector is involved in coordinating their projects, which we'll see here in a minute. Now, unfortunately, following the close of the capital culture led to somehow a return to the routine. So it's not that this super strategic approach continued on post event. It sort of was very much tied to the event, packaged up, finished, and then returned to work as normal. So here we see a map of all of the projects the heritage related projects that were completed, over 150, 300 million euros invested, which tied together both the 2001 G8 and 2004 Capital Culture, which because of this great level of detailed planning, they could do both events in tandem. And so some were done for 2001, others for 2004. But we see here, unlike the earlier event, a much greater connection of a system that includes the waterfront, but many different streets, structures. And within this, there was a huge variety of works that were done. So this included refitting a number of facades. Genoa is famous for its painted and very colorful facades, many of which were hidden or by years and years of pollution. Many streets, which today are very popular, crowded streets, were pedestrianized during the event. So for years were thought of as being impossible to change or to fix because the traffic was so dependent on these areas, but now have become in very important thoroughfares for both locals and tourists visiting the city. And the main square, the Piazza dei Ferrari, and the large fountain were also refurbished. So a wide variety of activities were completed. Here we see again some of the restoration works being completed on the facades, other piazzas and squares being repaved. So it was a very holistic approach in thinking about, one, how do people move around the city, and all of the sort of necessary investments in that. So also a number of restorations inside of churches and other structures, another very small street, which the medieval center is filled with, these small, very almost alleys to work through. But there was a very clear plan that had highlighted the need for all of these different projects to be completed. And one way of seeing the success from that, and this was one of the very clearly stated goals of Genoa, was they gained 2 years later World Heritage status for the system of the Strade Nuove, the new streets, and the Roli Palace, the system of Roli Palaces. And in the dark black line, you see the main World Heritage boundary of the site, and within that, a number of the streets and palaces that were restored through these two events, which we can imagine if those restorations had not taken place, it's unlikely that such a large area would have been still recognized, as it wouldn't have been in the condition. And then when we look at the larger buffer zone, we see even more of that area in particular was also affected and improved as a result of hosting the event. So clearly, heritage played a significant role in Genoa's approach to hosting the European capital culture. And when we look long term, as one of the advantages of studying Genoa was to see evolution over time, and if we can begin to identify any trends, we see there is a clear increase in total overnight visitors, which they wanted to grow tourism. It was not known as a touristic city previously. And so that did take place. But if we look a bit more closely, we begin to understand that while the aquarium and the fairgrounds visitors decreased, we actually see an increase. The only area that we see an increase is in the museum system, which would suggest that it's actually the cultural and the heritage of the city of Genoa that's attracting people to come visit and to stay and spend more time there. Whereas previously, many people would come one-day trip, see the aquarium, and then leave. And in fact, we see actually at one point the aquarium, there were more visitors to the aquarium than actual total overnight visits to the city. So, which means very few people were coming to spend time in Genoa. They were coming more so to see just the aquarium, even in the year 2004 of celebration. And we see here this trend of increase over time in many capitals of culture. So, a way the event is somehow preparing cities for future trends. And I think it really shows the power of transforming the image of the city and making it much more attractive for visitors. And so some of the key takeaways from this case, I think that we can see and understand is the need for this long-term vision and a urban regeneration program, not individual buildings or single areas, but this complex thinking of the entire city and how it functions. And understanding that it's not just the event, but an event combined with many other funding opportunities and measures. Then really the development of this tourism economy in the historic city center that really was not so strong or prevalent previously. Part of that then connected was creating a new city museum system, which was before just individual museums and then became connected, again, promoting them a bit more holistically throughout for locals and visitors, and then finally becoming a World Heritage City, really demonstrating the true value of the heritage in the city and all of the work that they had accomplished. So we see those were some of the key elements that required or necessitated to get to these outcomes. It wasn't something that just happened by, okay, we had the event, great, everything's fixed. There was much work and preparation that went into it, which unfortunately then when we look at, I won't go into it now, but the post-event period, that there was not this continued or ongoing thinking about how to do it strategically how to keep everyone involved, get the private and public actors cooperating together. Um, and the city in some ways has, while not halted, perhaps plateaued a bit and not continued growing in other sectors as much as they would have hoped. And so we see really, okay, this focus on culture and tourism is one part of a larger puzzle that they could maybe have been thinking about more as a whole rather than just this as a separate piece. So moving now to Liverpool, which hosted a few years later the Capital of Culture in 2008, we'll see a lot of similarities as it is also a cultural mega event within a strategic regeneration plan, but one which largely overlooks heritage. And so we'll see this is where the key really in the approach and planning and who's involved makes a very significant difference. Because in some ways, Liverpool is very similar to Genoa. They were both previously deindustrialized cities. They were losing population for decades. They had, especially in Liverpool, a very negative uh, um, reputation throughout the UK. And so for them, the European Capital of Culture was really a way to promote themselves, try to present a new Liverpool, to rebrand, show that it is a cultural city, it is a creative city. And looking back at some of the past examples like Glasgow 1990, which did a very similar procedure. And like the case of Genoa, we see again a number of urban plans, programs, and events in a 15-year period. So in the years leading up to the event as well as after, there's a significant focus on the city, particularly the city center, and trying to not just rebrand, but really fix a lot of the major problems. So again, it's not just an event on its own, but an event really clearly embedded within these. And when you go through these plans over and over and over again, the European Capital of Culture comes up as the key moment to try to fix or solve certain issues, to present a new Liverpool to the country or to Europe or to the world. So we see again a few distinct phases in the city's development. So during the 80s, there was an attempt to do some of these same things to fix some of these issues through this garden event, a few other significant investments. Also thinking about heritage with the Albert Docks was a very important restoration project, but they were all in a way very scattered. They were not connected one to another, and in the long end, they did make, of course, bring some improvements, but not perhaps to the degree or level that was hoped for or expected. So then when we get to the late 90s, early 2000s, we see this renewed push to regenerate the city, but in a much more coordinated manner. And this is where particularly the development of the Liverpool Vision was an entity that was developing a lot of plans, strategies. They were cooperating with a regional funding body, the NWDA, so they were bringing in more money, getting European funds, as well as national funds, a lot of private investment, as we'll see. So it was a lot of factors brought together. And interestingly, the city was granted World Heritage status right before hosting the European Capital of Culture. So early on, there was a clear alignment between the city's heritage and the Capital of Culture event, that these things would almost work together. But as plans started developing, it somehow they became further and further apart, and heritage is left out in a way, and the focus comes much more on development, particularly private, promoting private development. And so there is a very expensive physical regeneration of the city center. We see here a number of streets that were part of the city center movement strategy, which was a big investment to improve flows and traffic and pedestrianization. And then this large triangular area that we see is the Liverpool One development, which is over a £1 billion pound private investment in the city centre, which saw a complete change, essentially destroying many of the existing buildings and rebuilding what more or less a shopping centre, but fit within the urban fabric. And we see some other heritage projects in here, but they were not so closely coordinated or brought together or overlapping like we did in the case of Genoa. So this is the Liverpool One shopping center, which has had a very significant impact on the city center, on bringing retail back into this area, promoting growth. But it's not so much, it's aware of the urban fabric, but there wasn't a lot of heritage projects connected to this. It was essentially entirely new construction. One or two instances, but not as heavily as we saw as the main key focus in the case of Genoa. What is interesting about this case is despite all of this other development happening, and then heritage being left out, so to say, from the official program within the Capital Culture event, within these private approaches, we see a number of. There's someone who's left their microphone on. I'd ask just if you could quick check and mute yourself. Thank you very much. There's a final, we see here there were some heritage projects that were completed. It's not that there was no heritage involved, but that it was essentially entirely disconnected. It was independently organized. So projects that other groups decided, we should restore these structures. These are an important part of our city's heritage. It would be a shame to have this big event and not have these buildings regenerated and lively and part of what's happening. So we see the university taking a role, a number of arts organizations, developers, local museums, preservation trust, but they're very scattered. They're not necessarily connected to each other. Some of them were involved in the program, such as the St. George Hall restoration, one of the most important neoclassical buildings in all of Europe, and unfortunately sat rotting for 20, 30 years. Part of it was still in use, but a lot of it was empty and abandoned, and was in severe need of funding and restoration. So this preservation trust was developing this in any case, regardless of with or without the capital culture. But what we see is there was then a final sort of an alignment. So this became the site of the main opening ceremony for 2008. They had many events throughout the year, and in the year since, it's become a really key place within the city to organize, to have concerts. When the Liverpool football team wins a championship, they come here to celebrate. But so there was it wasn't part of the event, but somehow eventually came connected. The university developed the Victoria Gallery and Museum, which was part of what the original university building is quite important and historic also nationally, but sat empty and unused for a number of years. That finally the university decided, yes, on the occasion of this event, this is our gift to the city, is the way that they described it in interviews. So they wanted to have something that they were offering. So we see the potential of the event to really motivate a number of actors, which is definitely one of the strengths. However, with this overall, the sort of city council's approach, which was very much in charge of developing or very connected to the development of the event, with their focus much more on development, we see some worrying post-event trends. Because in some ways the event was so successful, it did put Liverpool back on the map. It did bring a lot of interest in funding future development. That also brought some problems for the heritage of the city. Some positive aspects, but also a lot of issues. So because of this top image is the Liverpool Waters Development Scheme, which you see a number of towers, skyscrapers involved, which there currently are none in Liverpool. So these would be the sort of first significant towers to be built. And this has been a great concern for UNESCO and actually led to UNESCO including Liverpool on the list of World Heritage in Danger sites in 2012, where it still sits to this day. And there have been moments where it seems it may actually be delisted. It's now sort of a warning. It's not delisted yet, but it could happen, which would make it only the third site ever to be delisted from UNESCO. And we see some other numbers, for example, that are interesting. In 2009, so while, right after having hosted this massive cultural event, there were still 440 structures, listed historic structures in the city of Liverpool that were at risk. So we see, by 2016, that number's dropped down to 66, which seems at first very significant. However, one of the examples of that, of a building no longer being at risk, is this case here. We see this is on number 6, Sir Thomas Street. So a historic building on the only street entirely with Victorian structures. Prior to this building being listed, the developer who was creating a hotel inside quickly destroyed the facade in order to put up their very modern contemporary one. And in this case was considered a successful reuse of a heritage site. So it's no longer at risk, purely because it's no longer abandoned or empty. So even though there may have been damage or destruction caused, it's, in their minds of this listing system was no longer considered at risk. So we see these long-term effects of heritage not necessarily being prioritized or being compromised, that if it's not in an economic advantage, it's expendable and can be removed. Even the mayor has famously said the World Heritage listing is just a piece of paper on the wall in the city hall. So there are some issues when potentially heritage becomes quite removed or disconnected from an event such as the European Capital of Culture. This map here, we see the dark line again is the World Heritage Site, and within that, the dashed is the proposed Liverpool Waters development, which is a 30-40 year long development. So they're beginning to build some of it now. They've not built all of it, but a large section of it sits in the World Heritage Site, and the entirety of it is in the buffer zone. So it is a very important, sensitive area of the city, which much of that area is in fact empty. And it's not that nothing should be done, but rather it's the approach, the way of thinking about this, and who's involved in making decisions or not. And even recently now, there's been some corruption charges against the mayor, so it's unclear what's going to be happening in the future. But we can see from the case of Liverpool, which at the starting point has many similarities to that of Genoa, a clear divergence. So while the capital of culture, it was a clear impetus to develop a strategic city regeneration that in some ways has been very successful, and unfortunately those goals came to entirely overshadow heritage priorities. And in a city where there actually was a lot of heritage need, I unfortunately don't have any pictures to add here, but there were a number of these abandoned, falling apart historic structures that rather than fix them, the city covered them with posters and banners, which they called the sort of grot. They were, cover the grot. And it was one approach. So they wanted to make the city look nice for visitors rather than actually dealing with some of the problems. On a positive note, we can see that the capital of culture really did motivate external actors and institutions. So rather maybe than the city taking the lead, we see a number of other actors standing up, and which can be a very positive thing if they're interested in protecting heritage. When they're purely motivated in development or the economic side, that's where we run into some problems. Which we see over the long term also with UNESCO threatening them or putting them to the list of World Heritage Sites in danger, which still nearly 10 years later has not been resolved. And also within that time, there's been a clear decrease in funding for conservation projects, or decrease in interest with a number of conservation officers leaving the city council and not being replaced. There's no longer any current plan for heritage sites in the city. There again have been some local initiatives developed by a number of NGOs that are working towards those goals. But we see, unfortunately, when an event is perhaps very successful but overlooks heritage, there can be a number of issues and problems. So finally, going to the case of Istanbul, which is the last case hosted in 2010, and we see competing visions for heritage in a cultural mega event. The case of Istanbul, if Liverpool and Genoa were some ways very similar or sort of twin cases, Istanbul is completely, entirely a different scale, different context. First, it's the previous cases were both around cities of 400,000 residents. At the time of 2010, there's a population of 14 million, official figure in the city of Istanbul, perhaps even higher. There were over on the historic peninsula alone 4 World Heritage sites you see in the black border, but an additional 10,000 properties listed. So a huge, huge volume of heritage, a sort of overwhelming amount of heritage, and also a very ancient heritage which extends back not only the Ottoman Empire, but the Byzantine previously. And it's become a city that's exploded in tourism, already very highly visited in 2010, over 6 million visitors to over 12 and a half just 5 years later. And unfortunately, a number of existing laws that, rather than protect heritage, allow the potential destruction of heritage if it's deemed in need of urban regeneration, encouraging tourism, or also earthquakes. So there's sort of a lot of loopholes that allow local owners or developers around heritage protection restrictions. And when looking at the capital of culture in 2010, um, they very clearly prioritized the city's heritage. You can see in this promotional ad, they claimed that they were the original history channel, um, which is quite the claim for any city to make in the world. But there's a clear point of view that you come to Istanbul because of its heritage. And they expect that's what is motivating most visitors and what they expect to see and what they expect to find. However, in the original proposal to host the event, it was a much more a bottom-up proposal. There were a lot of NGOs involved, a lot of community groups, and the goal was to have this event to really highlight the potential, of these different groups, the activities they were doing, to give them a bit more visibility. And the local and also national governments were not involved. However, when the city then did finally win the right to host the event, those other levels became very involved. And even UNESCO at one point very directly suggested that the city use the event to protect some of these World Heritage sites that were also potentially at risk of going on the endangerment list. Um, so there were a lot of, already from the very beginning, different points of view with these local actors who had a certain interest. But then you had the municipality, the metropolitan municipality, and the central government who had different ideas and interests. Then we have a lot of city plans where the event isn't even mentioned or might get one line. So it was a very, promoted as being very important, but then not so connected to what else was going on. And as we'll see, it became quite confusing of who was in charge of which aspects. But in the end, a significant portion of the budget was dedicated to heritage-related projects. So a number of restoration and conservation works were done from very important sites like Hagia Sophia or Süleymaniye Square, to also then a number of minority sites. So there was a huge range of works that were done and were completed. And at the scale of a city like Istanbul, perhaps is necessary to be working across the board. Um, the event has a quite interesting governance that's very unusual compared to most other cities, in that the 2010 agency that was in charge of organizing the event was actually directly under the Prime Minister of Turkey, and was even in a way separate or outside of the direct control of the central government, the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, or local municipalities. Yet we see that essentially all of these groups somehow were involved by the prime minister, and so all of these different ministries or directorates had some influence or control on what was happening. So rather than one entity, perhaps locally based, like the city council in the case of Liverpool, directing plans and understanding what the needs of the city really were, we see a bit of confusion across with all of these different groups involved. So on one hand, the 2010 agency was actually quite successful in bringing together all of these different actors from the local, regional, or national levels. And many of them had never before sat even in the same room to discuss similar issues. What should be the future of Istanbul? How do we address these various heritage issues? So in some ways it was, it was an important moment to finally be bringing together different people. In many of the interviews, it was the first time local actors were working with national actors, even if they were in the same field. And so it was a key way to start moving forward and thinking about a number of problems. But unfortunately, as we've seen time and time again, following the event, this wasn't continued. So essentially by December 31st, 2010, the agency was dissolved and everything went back to normal. So there was this period of time, the years leading up to the event and during the year itself, that perhaps there was a bit more integration or collaboration taking place, but it doesn't come to have such an impact on the final outcomes when we look at the spread of heritage works that were completed for Istanbul 2010. If you see the small scale at the bottom of the map, we're working with something entirely different than the last two cases. A massive city, a massive area, and so rather than focusing on one, one succinct city center like in Genoa, the projects were spread out. Part of this was, again, due to the fact there wasn't a single vision, there wasn't a single plan guiding all of the works. With all of this money available, it became a bit of a free fall. So whatever projects were already being developed by different actors, essentially they said, hey, I've got this, I'll take the money. And that's what we see, is that things were a bit ad hoc in a way, because they needed to get things done for the event, and there wasn't the time to necessarily start projects from scratch, especially heritage related works, which require years of study preparation to make sure that damage isn't done. So that's one of the clashes that we can see between heritage and these events, is that of the time frame, that events are meant to be very strict, they're unchangeable, and there's a very short period of time, a number of years, whereas heritage often can require many, many years, very long-term point of view, in order to properly get things done. So overall, there were 50 diverse different projects completed throughout not just the historic peninsula, but a number of other areas in the city. And importantly, to note, it was the first time that public money in Turkey was used to fund the restoration of minority heritage sites. So we'll see a few examples of both Jewish and Armenian heritage sites that often were overlooked or could only get funding from outside groups or from private sources. So it was a significant step, at least for a period of time, that these sorts of projects were being recognized and being funded. And as I mentioned, many were existing projects of the municipality. So though there was this idea for the NGOs and local community groups to be very involved, it ended up being mostly government controlled in the end. So there was a bit of clashing. Some projects come through, like we see here on the left, the Vortvatsvordeman Church, which had been unfortunately abandoned for about a century. For decades, they had been trying to get funding and had been unable. So they had this project designed by a local architect that then, thanks to the event, they could actually implement. On the right, we see some of the very traditional wooden homes of Istanbul in the Zerek neighborhood. So on the left, we see one that was restored under the program, and one on the right that wasn't. And so unfortunately, not it wasn't that all of these homes were restored and we see an entire urban area regenerated. We see a few pieces here and there that are improved, thankfully, so that they won't be lost completely. But still a lot of work left to be done. And particularly when I was there doing my research, and 5 years later, saw a number of these areas that these were part of the World Heritage Sites, were also areas where various projects were done. A number of buildings that either had already been demolished or were essentially decaying away. And this project near to the ancient Byzantine Theodosian land walls, a project where there was not much care clearly being taken to protect the site in terms of the movement of materials and large equipment. So despite all of these, the UNESCO World Heritage Committee decided that, okay, Istanbul, because they did fix a few things, was fine, and no longer considered them for delisting, despite these sorts of activities still ongoing. So we see a little, perhaps, bit of difference between how Liverpool was treated for a future plan versus how Istanbul was treated for the actions that they were taking there in the moment. So that's a whole nother discussion we could get into. But unfortunately, we see, despite many of the great works that were accomplished for 2010, those didn't carry through. They were not necessarily adopted over the long term. It was once more a one and done. And we see that actually not even half of the projects that were being funded were completed on time for 2010. The majority of them were either delayed and finished in the following years, and a number still, when I was there in 2015-16, were uncompleted. And very unfortunately, saw sites like these on the left, the David Pasha Medresi, which was a structure previously that was intact, was operational, but was slated for a restoration project and to be converted into a new use. And because they didn't finish the project by the deadline, the agency collapsed, and the building was left like this. So there was no one strictly, in some of the cases, no single entity in charge for ensuring that works were carried through, even if they weren't done by 2010. So years later, we see sites like this, or projects like the Meir Synagogue on the right that were promised to be restored, got delayed for a number of political issues and then dropped and abandoned. So even though funding was allocated to that and in the official event budget, it still says this project was funded. In the end, it never was. So we see different issues than we did in the other cases. Unfortunately, the governance in this instance, on a positive note, did bring together many different actors that are too often separate, but also it didn't manage to overcome existing conflicts or differences in their points of view and what they wanted to do with the event. And it also left no one then singly in charge or in control of these works to guarantee that they'd be finished over the long term. We do see, thankfully, a number of overlooked minority heritage projects that were funded in a very important way. Again, unfortunately, that's not been an ongoing continuous trend. In fact, post 2010, in recent years, we've seen there's been cuts to cultural funding or to preservation funding. So this was a really unique moment that there was so much money available from the central state, but unfortunately didn't encourage ongoing efforts. Then there is a clear disconnect between the event organization and other city plans. In some cases, the same project was being developed twice by the two different bodies. And overall, there was just a lack of legacy preparation and how to make sure that sites weren't abandoned like they were. So between the three cases, we see a number of similarities, also a number of differences. Some of them are quite unique. And we could say generally, if we try to define them, there were three shared goals across them that each in some way was trying to, regenerate, develop tourism, as well as we're aiming towards specific future goals. And we see in all three, there were a number of regeneration physical projects that were completed and carried out either by the entity in charge or other private actors. All three clearly were looking to promote tourism in some way. In the case of Istanbul and Genoa, more so focused on their heritage, less so in the case of Liverpool, and with a variety of future goals. So both Genoa and Liverpool were looking to continue growing, promote development, while Istanbul, already a very clearly global city, had no need to grow further. It has been growing, but that was besides the point. They were at that point interested in EU ascension. Clearly, in the years since, that's no longer the case. But at that point, they were wanting to really harness the event to show how European the city of Istanbul and Turkey as a whole is. And then also, they were actually interested in using this to host the Olympic Games, which that has also not yet happened. But they wanted to host one mega event in order to have another later mega event, similarly to what we saw in Genoa. It's interesting when we look at the breakdown of the cost. First, because typically Istanbul is stated as being the most expensive capital culture ever, with a budget of nearly 300 million euros, which was the official budget program that was divided between heritage projects in the, as you see here, in the light gray, and then the program budget in the dark gray. So these two aspects we see in most capitals of culture. And technically, yes, that is higher than what was allocated for Genoa or Liverpool. However, both Genoa and Liverpool then had huge or very significant external funding that was not necessarily part of the event, but was attached to the event in some way. So in the case of Genoa, this was infrastructural investments, namely in the new metro system, which puts the total well over 600 million in terms of all of the projects that were being funded with the deadline of 2004. Liverpool, we have the private Liverpool One project as well as all of the public investment, which takes the total to over 2 billion euros of investment. So and those are much smaller cities, so that 300 million of Istanbul actually is quite insignificant when we look at a city of 14 million people. And the fact there wasn't any other significant attached funding to develop other aspects of the city in conjunction, whether in terms of venues or infrastructure. So it helps give a bit more balanced image of what was done and why perhaps other events, in a way, why Liverpool did have such a significant impact was that the overall investment was significantly higher. Then in the book, I'll introduce briefly the sort of final analysis approach that I took, which was to look at the inherent qualities versus the secondary effects in each of the cases. And so what do I mean by those? Inherent qualities in terms of both heritage and the program. So for heritage, this is the actual stuff. What is it made of? Is it, the authenticity of it, the accuracy of conservation, or maybe reactivating unused heritage spaces, giving, that it's alive and living. In the case of the event, it'd be the program. So the actual nature, the qualities of what makes it it, versus secondary effects, which are the hoped for or desired spin-off impacts that, and I found interestingly or surprisingly, were often the main motivator. So rather than the actual, okay, we want to have really a strong cultural program, or we want to really make sure our heritage is promoted in a proper way, it's, well, actually, we want to create a new city image, so we'll use heritage. Or we want to grow tourism, so we'll use, culture for that. Or it's about increasing real estate prices or attracting the private investments, growing the population. In all three cases, it was clear that many of the motivations were actually the secondary effects. And sometimes those intersect with the inherent qualities, sometimes not. So in each of the three cases, I won't go into all of this too in depth, but generally we can see there was much more an intersection in the inherent qualities of the event and heritage within this case. And there were many also desired secondary effects, but not so much at the cost or the expense of heritage itself. Whereas when we go to Liverpool, we see there was not so much within at least the official program a strong overlap of focus on the inherent qualities. Much more on the secondary effects was where the focus was through a number of other projects, other funding, the development, and within the official program, as I mentioned, it was covering these grot spots was the only real direct addressing of historic structures, unfortunately. And then finally, Istanbul was a bit more spread out. It's not as heavily focused on. There were many inherent aspects that were dealt with. Very importantly, very critically, a number of structures that were in urgent need of restoration, of funding. So those were very positive aspects. But again, perhaps not as successful overall or holistically because of the lack of planning and integration and looking at how all of these relate together. So we can see, in a way, the three different approaches taken by the three different cases in what was really being valued, what was the main motivation in hosting the event, what were they hoping to accomplish, and looking forward a bit to what the future of events might be, as I mentioned at the very beginning, where in a particular moment to be thinking about mega events, as they've all been canceled over the last year. So we have not had the Olympics, we've not had the Expo, the European Capitals of Culture in Galway and Rijeka happened a bit digitally and then have been extended, but more or less have been, deleted. And the next host cities are more or less delaying to host until later years because they don't want to host at this point when it's impossible to have events or it's impossible to have visitors. So it's an interesting moment to see, okay, going forward, how will events have to react not just to COVID, but in part of that, how does that continue these two trends that I mentioned at the very beginning? And I think clearly, first of all, we see cultural mega events can serve as a heritage tool in a variety of ways, both very directly or indirectly, and they can generate a lot of support for projects. And there's in interesting ways. And I think that's something future cities can learn from. How can they generate broad, wide support? How can they attach these events into plans that not just sort of uses or tries to monetize heritage, but really values and protects it? How can they bring in heritage actors or local community groups in the decision-making processes, as well as the private sector? And they also have an important role to play. So I think all of the cases do provide something unique or interesting to learn from. Then we have, I argue, the potential for sport mega events to have a similar effect. And we'll see that in the coming years with both Paris, Milan, and other future events. In part, perhaps for response to COVID, will that force cities or shift them to need to spread out events across existing areas? So rather than concentrating everyone in one tight location, do you need to, for health and safety reasons, now have multiple locations all at once? And are some of those now existing historic spaces in cities, or maybe underrepresented historic spaces in cities? So I will leave more or less the presentation with that as a kind of big picture overview. I hope it was interesting, made sense. I'll leave this here for a minute. So if anyone is interested in getting in contact with me or finding more information on the book, perhaps you know, if your local library you think needs a copy, you can ask them to order. And of course, if you're interested in more information about the research I've been doing in the Tau lab with Professor Ponzini, as well as again Enrico Tommarchi, who I'll invite here in a minute, you can see that more on our website there, just taulab.polyme.it, and we have a number of research tabs, so you'll find Homey in there. So I will stop talking so I don't go on any further. I thank you all very much for your time, your patience, your attendance, and I look forward to having a fruitful discussion. So I will now I'll stop sharing my screen, and I will introduce again my colleague Enrico Tommarchi, who's very kindly joining us here today. So I'll leave it to him to kick off our discussion. Enrico, if you want to share any slides or do anything, let me know. I can give you the power presenter. Otherwise, feel free to start. I leave the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zach. Hello, everyone, and thanks a lot for having me. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to give a bit of feedback and comment a bit on this book. Not only because I thought when I read it that it was a very timely book, but also because I think that it is also a contribution that was very much needed at this point. Because if you look at the literature, in particular in the last few years, you'll notice that, of course, there has been a pretty lively debate about mega events, and in particular about what makes an event a mega event. And then, while this debate was taking place, there were also two different global trends really acting upon events, which Zachary has very well portrayed in his book. First of all, on the one hand, you have the very largest of these schemes, the one which are considered basically the only one deserving the title of mega events, which are being downscaled. And you can see this in two different trends. So the first one is the fact that there has been pressures on trying to reduce the huge spending of the Olympics, for example. And then there have been many withdrawn bids and many bidding processes which have been actually stopped in many cities. Think, for example, about Rome, for instance, because these processes failed to get political support at the local or national level, or even failed to generate momentum and to let's say, reach critical mass to become a full bid, a submitted bid. And you can see this, for example, in the case of Stockholm, in the case of Rome. There are many cases where, also in the Netherlands, for example, the joint Amsterdam and Rotterdam bid for the Olympics, you can see many examples where local and national governments are saying no thanks because of the huge spending that these events require. Of course, we are in time of austerity, and therefore all these issues need to be taken into account. The other global trend that we can see, which has been commented in the literature in the last few years only, is the fact that other events, smaller scale events, are becoming more and more popular, in particular amongst policymakers. So you have policymakers in really small, medium-sized towns and cities in Europe, in particular, who are very much interested in bidding for events like the European Capital of Culture or the UK City of Culture and so on. And you can see this spreading of events, which Zachary has very effectively portrayed. And therefore, I think this is a very important contribution because it highlights two things. The first one is that maybe we have the largest of these schemes like the Olympics or the World Cup, the Football World Cup, and cultural mega events like European Capital of Culture actually to some extent converging in terms of scale, budgets, and so on. Of course, this is something which might be a very long-term sort of perspective, but you can argue that actually there is this trend towards having smaller Olympics or smaller scale mega events, and then cultural mega events becoming more popular. And even the concept of cultural mega events, it is very, very important because we have been a lot of discussion about what exactly a mega event is. And then we have this new concept, the concept of cultural mega events, saying, okay, we have cultural festivals, things like European Capital of Culture and so on, which can be considered mega if you look at the sort of impact that they have on host cities. And this is a very powerful statement. So very happy to have the opportunity of highlighting this. And also, Zachary suggests very cleverly that we should perhaps be looking at events. We should be try to define events on a sort of relative perspective, on a sort of context-specific perspective. So looking at the fact that we have having medium-sized cities. I think, for example, Paphos, European Capital of Culture in 2017, 35,000 inhabitants. So it is a good number to consider. And you can say that events like the European Capital of Culture in such cities can actually produce very considerable impacts, which can be compared to those produced by the Olympics in certain places in global cities. So this is a very powerful idea, in my opinion. And it is also very interesting, the connection that Zachary makes between the sort of primary and secondary effects of mega events, and also the primary and secondary effects or aims in relation to the promotion of heritage. You have seen many aspects highlighted, and I would like to focus in particular, to spend a couple of words in particular in relation to the sort of secondary effects that can be aimed for in relation to the promotion of heritage, because we have been talked about for things like the promotion of cities' images. We have talked about things like tourism growth and so on. But there are also other aspects, such as, for example, the role of mega events in promoting and in generating secondary effects in terms of heritage in relation to civic pride, for example. So try to think about the fact about how a mega event can mobilize heritage assets in a way that not only the image of the city can be changed, can be modified, but also the local population is actually proud to live there. So you have a different sort of internal image, not only an external image which is improved, but also an internal image which is rather different. And also think about this in relation to the stigmatization of places. Places like Genoa or Liverpool, where there was a narrative of socioeconomic decline due to deindustrialization and so on. Places where the mega event was able to mobilize local heritage in a way that positive media narratives, positive narratives about the city started to circulate, and therefore the sort of preconceptions around these places could be counteracted. I can also bring the example of Hull, which was the UK City of Culture in 2017. And there was a similar process there, in the sense that the event was able to mobilize certain heritage assets, certain cultural venues, and also certain local stories and so on, which contributed to generating positive media narratives about the city, which counteracted those of a perhaps declining industrial port city, which dominated the past decades, for instance. And also, bringing again the example of Hull, mega events can contribute can help mobilize certain secondary effects in terms of heritage, for example, in relation to the fact that you can have a visible connection between past, present, and future of cities. And again, in Hull, there was one of the very opening events of the UK City of Culture, which was Blade, consisted in a wind turbine rotor blade. So one big piece of a wind turbine rotor, actually an offshore wind turbine rotor, the ones that you see on the horizon when you are on the beach, for example. And this huge object was placed in the city's main square, and therefore it contributed to encouraging discussions about the past, so the maritime history of the city, but also the future of the city as a energy port city, as a hub in the development of renewable energies. To try to think about also this aspect, this particular aspect, and this role that MegaEvents can have. And also what was interesting in this book was also the list of sort of aspects that can contribute to creating synergies between MegaEvents and heritage. So Zachary, of course, said that these synergies are more likely when the MegaEvent is part of a long-term vision. And we can, of course, agree with that, in particular in relation to the very, very important concept of legacy, which is a bit of a buzzword today, but it's also a very important aspect. And we can consider also examples where these events were actually part of long-term visions, but these visions was perhaps not very much shared with the rest of the local community. And therefore, the MegaEvent actually failed to mobilize heritage and to produce these long-term legacies. Try to think, for example, this is particularly the case of sporting MegaEvents, where you have, well, they are actually part of a long-term legacy of regeneration, but then they also raised opposition, conflicts, and so on. So try to think about this as well. And also the very important aspect of mobilizing, making use of the MegaEvent to actually bring heritage actors and experts together. We have seen the example of Istanbul was very, very good in this. And we have other examples where having, for example, a culture company was key to bring these experts and organizations and funders together. Again, the example of Hull, UK City of Culture, is key here, because having this venue, the culture company venue, made it possible to have better connections with, for example, national funders, but also to bring the expertise of local heritage experts who made it possible to have certain events within the cultural calendar, which actually contributed to raise awareness of certain, so to speak, less well-known aspects of the city history and heritage, which were nonetheless celebrated within the framework of a MegaEvent. And another important aspect, which was a bit recurrent in Zachary's presentation, is also the fact that cultural MegaEvents, in comparison with other large-scale MegaEvents, are very much adaptable. They can be adapted to the context because, of course, for example, in the case of the European Capital of Culture, cities do have certain guidelines. So the bid must include certain aspects, but then cities are very much free to organize, to plan and deliver the event as they wish. And therefore, this can be adapted to different contexts, which is something that you don't necessarily find in sporting MegaEvents, for example, where the need of having certain sporting facilities in the end can be detrimental to heritage, can damage heritage. So, for example, you can think of things like the America's Cup in Valencia, and also the Formula One European Grand Prix, again in Valencia, where the need of having certain sporting facilities in the end contributed to concealing heritage assets rather than mobilizing them. And then, since there was no real legacy of these events, in the end you have a permanent negative impact on the city's heritage, and then you need different policies to try to reverse this tendency. And this also trying to think also about this aspect. This is also a question for Zachary and also the broader audience. And just a few quick reflections about how to read this book in 2021. So how to read cultural mega events in 2021. Zachary touched upon some key aspects in relation in particular to COVID-19. But I wanted to point out certain aspects which are very important to read this book today, because it's still very timely, still very actual. Because, first of all, despite the pandemic, despite all the restrictions, despite all the cancellations of certain events like, for example, the Tokyo Olympics or the European Football Cup, there is still an undiminished interest in cultural mega events, not necessarily in the largest possible schemes, but there is very much an interest in cultural mega events. And you can see this, for example, the case again of the UK. Sorry, I'm talking a lot about the UK, but you can imagine why I'm doing so. Which is, for example, the case of, well, you know that Coventry is this year's UK City of Culture. And there is also a competition going on to designate the next UK City of Culture in 2025. And a lot of cities have been interested in bidding. A lot of cities have submitted bids. And you can see that there are policymakers in many of these cities, like Southampton or Bradford, who are very much interested in gaining the event, because the event is key within their long-term strategy of regeneration and urban development. So the interest is not diminished, notwithstanding the pandemic. And here, this because you can see that the very key role of the very key, let's say, adaptable character of these events, because this interest is very much focusing on these events, mainly because they are very adaptable. So, for example, you can see the case of Coventry, where unfortunately they had to really revise completely their cultural program. Nonetheless, the event is taking place. So you have online events, blended things, and so on. Something is happening virtually. Something will be happening this summer, where restrictions will be eased. And this was possible because it was the UK City of Culture, and there was a certain freedom in shaping the event. So this is another aspect to consider. And also, of course, because of COVID, we might be dealing with potentially changing public attitudes. Again, adaptability is key, because you might have different attitudes toward, for example, mass gathering, cultural leisure, even cultural consumption, things like that, which unfortunately are the key elements of many urban regeneration strategies. But you can see here how having a very adaptable event can help in coping with these different and probably volatile changing attitudes. And what about the changing heritage opportunity and threats? Because of course, having more spread events in existing venues, also having online events is also impacting on heritage. So we are seeing a lot of virtual tours of heritage sites being proposed now. In particular, this was in particular the case of the UK during the first lockdown, where all public heritage sites and so on were closed. And therefore, the role of virtual tools was very important to keep the public engaged with heritage. That was fundamental. And you can see how this can help, for example, in making the public more aware of certain less well-known heritage, where you can offer a virtual tool, in particular, within the framework of a mega event, which is very much visible, very much advertised, and therefore this can be a contribution to heritage awareness within the local community. And this is also connected to the role of digital technologies, because online blended events, which not necessarily require mass gathering and huge numbers of people attending these events, can also be useful, can also be helpful, and can be an opportunity to make use of different heritage sites within a mega event. So you can have, for example, less well-known and even fragile heritage sites being used as part of the event. Because, for example, you can have a blended event with very few people attending in person, but then you can benefit from a huge visibility. And that particular heritage space can be advertised, can be shown, can be displayed to a much broader audience. So these are things to consider. And finally, the very big question, and this is perhaps a question to the audience and also Zachary as well. And what about austerity? Because austerity was a major problem in mega events in the last decade. It was a major problem in heritage promotion and conservation of heritage as well. What about the future? Will we have more austerity or we will have something different? So with this $1 million question, I can end my this discussion, but I'm very happy to engage with it if you have any questions or take part in it in the next, I don't know, what is it, half an hour or so?
Yes. Well, yeah,
Okay.
thank you very much,
Thank you.
Enrico. One, for your many kind words. I appreciate just also your, feedback, your thoughts, review of the work, the book, and again, after so many years to get here, it's glad to know that it's useful, it's relevant, it's not already outdated by the time it came out. So, and I think there were a lot of key points that you brought up that are really interesting, and I liked a lot the idea, the power of small events in particular is one that, as you were talking, came to mind. And especially now, I mean, all of these factors you've been listing here at the end, I see each of these as being and the next research project. We have, there are many more ideas, and also in the work we've been doing, we can see there's been a big evolution from maybe the focus of more on built urban heritage in the book to intangible heritage to more natural, heritage or regional heritage. There's a lot of issues, and now this issue, the virtual aspects and digital aspects, is a whole nother one. So, and to think of all of the relevance that this has in many different kinds of events across Europe or globally. So thank you for contributing those as well. I think it's valuable to see it's, yeah, just not these three cases. We have many instances we can look at. So I will, for the moment.